cold is what I remember most, though I cannot say for certain if it was the temperature of the air or the temperature of my blood. Memory is a traitor, especially when you are as old as I am, trying to reconstruct the architecture of a nightmare from the safety of a warm armchair. I tell myself it was November 1942 in that attic on the Rue St. George's, but perhaps it was December. It matters little. The cold was a physical weight, a living thing that sat on my chest and pressed down until my ribs groaned under the strain. It smelled of wet wool, ancient dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone bleeding from the suitcase radio open on the table before me. I was 22 years old, a child masquerading as a soldier, a student playing at spy. Before the world broke itself apart, my biggest concern had been the intricate, circular logic of Hegel's dialectics in the sun-drenched courtyards of the University of Lyon. I can still see the dust motes dancing in the light of those lecture halls, golden and lazy, utterly indifferent to the darkness gathering on the horizon. We sat there, my friends and I, wearing tweed jackets that smelled of pipe tobacco, debating the moral imperatives of Kant while Europe burned. We believed in logic then. We believed that the world was a rational place, structured by cause and effect, where it inevitably led to be, and where justice was a mathematical certainty if one could just derive the correct formula. That was the ordinary world, as the storytellers call it, a world of paper and ink, where the German language was the tongue of Goethe and Schiller, a vehicle for poetry and high philosophy. I loved the language then. I loved the way the compound words fit together like precision-engineered gears, heavy with meaning. I did not know yet that those same gears would be used to grind my country into paste. In the attic, the logic of the university dissolved. I tried to hold on to it. I tried to apply the rigor of my studies to the chaos of the underground. I told myself that if I followed the procedure, if I set the frequency correctly, if I kept the transmission short, if I encoded the pad without error, then I would be safe. It was the student's fallacy, the belief that if you study hard enough, you will pass the exam. But the Gestapo did not grade on a curve, and their exams were written in blood on the pavement of the Place Bellecoeur. I sat hunched over the transceiver, the headset clamping my ears, listening to the static. It was a roar like the ocean, a white noise that filled the hollow spaces of my skull. My fingers hovered over the key, trembling, not from the cold, but from the terrifying knowledge of what lay outside the skylight. The triangulation trucks. I had never seen one close up, but I had built a monster in my mind. I imagined them prowling the darkened streets of Lyon. Great black beasts with rotating loop antennas on their roofs, sniffing the air for the scent of my radio waves. It was a geometry of death. 2 trucks, 2 bearings, 1 intersection. And at that intersection, the silence between transmissions was worse than the noise. In the silence, the attic came alive. The building groaned as it settled in the frost. A rat scurried behind the wainscoting, the scratch of its claws sounding like the rasp of a boot on the stairwell. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear the engine of a truck, the slam of a car door, the heavy, rhythmic thud of the field police. Every sensory input was amplified. The itch of the wool scarf against my neck felt like a garrote. The taste of the stale acorn coffee in the tin cup was like bile. I looked at my hands. They were the hands of a boy who turned pages, not a soldier who strangled sentries. They were pale, the fingernails bitten down to the quick. What was I doing here? I should have been writing a thesis on the phenomenology of spirit, not waiting to die in a freezing garret. The absurdity of it made me want to laugh, but the laughter caught in my throat and tasted like vomit. I was a fraud. I was terrified that at any moment the door would burst open and they would see not a resistance fighter, but a frightened student who had lost his way. Then the static changed. It wasn't a sound so much as a texture in the noise, a rhythmic tearing of the white hiss. The signal. I grabbed the pencil, the wood slick against my sweating palm. The message came in bursts, a staccato rhythm that bypassed my conscious mind and went straight to the muscle memory I had agonizingly built over the last 6 months. My hand moved across the pad, turning the rhythmic pulses into letters, the letters into nonsense groups, waiting for the cipher to unlock them. I finished the transcription and reached for the one-time pad, the silk paper crinkling softly. My breath plumed in the freezing air as I worked the decryption. The letters rearranged themselves, shedding their chaotic camouflage to reveal the brutal truth underneath. I stared at the paper. The logic of the university, the safety of the abstract, shattered completely. Operation Torch Reprisal. Gestapo sweep active. Transmit all intel. No, I read it twice. The words swam before my eyes. Operation Torch. The Americans had landed in North Africa. That was the hope. But the reprisal, that was the reality. The Germans were seizing the free zone. They were flooding Lyon, and I was being ordered to light a flare in the darkness, to scream my position to the world just as the hunters were closing the net. I reached for the power switch. The vacuum tubes inside the radio began to glow, a dull, angry orange in the gloom, warming the air with the scent of burning dust. The hum of the transformer rose, a low vibration that I felt in my teeth. This was the moment, the threshold. I put the headset back on, and for a moment the static cleared. I spun the dial, searching for the frequency, and my hand froze. Through the earpiece, cutting through the atmospheric interference, came a voice. It was faint, distorted by distance and machinery, but it was clear enough. It was speaking German. Sector 4, sweeping, signal trace. My stomach dropped. It was not the poetic German of Rilke. It was the clipped, utilitarian German of the hunter. I understood every word. My studies, my ordinary world suddenly rushed back, not as a comfort, but as a weapon. I wasn't just hearing noise. I was hearing their intent. They were close. They were coordinating. And they were looking for a signal, just like the one I was about to send. I looked at the Morse key. It was a simple piece of machined brass on a bakelite base. To touch it was to invite death. To press it was to draw a line in the ether that pointed directly to this room. The student in me. The logician screamed that this was suicide. The rational move was to pack the suitcase, go out the window, and melt into the rooftops to survive. But then I thought of the faces of the others in the network. The baker who passed notes in loaves of bread. The girl who carried messages in her bicycle pump. If I didn't send this intelligence, the troop movements, the fortification plans we had bled to gather, they would be walking blind into a massacre. I closed my eyes. I stopped being Jean-Luc Dubois, the student of philosophy. I let the fear wash over me, cold and terrible, and then I pushed it down into my gut. I placed my fingers on the key. The first pressure was the hardest. It felt like pulling a trigger. I began to transmit. The room filled with the rhythmic, high-pitched stutter of the oscillator. It was deafening in the quiet attic, a shriek of defiance that I felt sure could be heard all the way to the hotel terminus. I fell into the trance of the operator, the fist taking over. My wrist remained loose, floating, tapping out the groups of 5 letters with a mechanical precision that belied the terror shaking my frame. With every sequence I sent, I visualized the radio waves expanding outward. Invisible concentric circles rippling over the slate roofs of Lyon, passing through the stone walls of the apartment buildings, washing over the German trucks. I was a lighthouse turning on its beam in the middle of an air raid. The world outside began to respond. At first it was just the wind. Then, rising above the hum of the city, came the wail, siren, not the air raid sirens, but the lower, urgent warble of police vehicles. They were distant, but they were growing louder. I kept transmitting. The sweat was running down my back now, cold and clammy. The smell of the ozone grew thicker, choking me. My hand began to cramp, the muscles protesting the relentless pace. But I forced the rhythm to hold. Discipline. I was halfway through the intelligence report when the rhythm of the night broke. Below me, 3 floors down, the heavy front door of the building slammed. It wasn't the wind. It was the heavy, authoritative slam of wood against frame, followed by the vibration of boots on the stairs. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the Morse. I had to finish. I had to. I tapped out the final group. The sirens were screaming now, a cacophony that seemed to be coming from the street directly below. I tore the headset off, the sudden silence of the room crashing in on me, heavier than the noise. The attic door handle turned. It wasn't a slow, stealthy turn. It was a desperate wrenching. The door flew open, hitting the wall with a dull thud that sent a cascade of dust drifting down from the rafters. I spun around, my hand instinctively going to the heavy codebook, the only weapon I had. It was Henry. His face was the color of old paper. His eyes wide, pupils dilated until they swallowed the iris. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving, sweat streaking the soot on his forehead. He didn't look at me. He looked at the radio, still glowing warm and orange on the table. "Jean-Luc," he wheezed, the words tearing out of his throat. "There on the street. I saw the truck from the landing." He pointed a shaking finger toward the skylight, toward the world outside that I had tried to shut out. "The antenna," he whispered, the horror vibrating in his voice. "It's turning. It's pointing right at us." Henry's panic was a contagion, a thick, suffocating heat that filled the small attic space, warring with the smell of ozone and stale cigarette smoke. He was right. The triangulation truck. The rotating loop antenna. It was the eye of the beast, and it had found us. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. The flight response was a physical pain, a tightening in the groin and a lightness in the head that promised unconsciousness if I did not move. I looked at the open codebook on the table. 3 lines of cipher text remained. The coordinates of the munitions depot in the suburbs. The timing of the guard shift changes. If I left now, the previous 10 minutes of transmission were nothing but noise. Without the target, the resistance cells would be striking at shadows. I looked at Henry. He was already backing toward the trapdoor, his eyes darting between me and the skylight. I could hear the truck engine idling below, a low, mechanical growl that vibrated in the floorboards. Then came the shouts. German, harsh clipped, tearing through the damp night air. I understood them perfectly. My university German, once used to deconstruct Goethe and Schiller, now translated my own death warrant. They were shouting for the house key. They were shouting for the sledgehammer. "Go," I said. The word was a stone dropping into a well. I did not recognize my own voice. It lacked the tremor that shook my hands. It was the voice of a man who had already accepted the end of the story. Henry froze. He looked at me, then at the radio, then back at me. He opened his mouth to argue, to plead, but the sound of wood splintering downstairs cut him off. The front door had given way. The heavy rhythmic pounding of jackboots on the parquet floor of the lobby echoed up the stairwell. It sounded like a drum beating a march to the gallows. "Get out," I whispered. I turned my back on him. I could not look at his face. If I looked at him, I would leave. I sat back down in the wooden chair. It creaked under my weight, a sound so domestic and ordinary it felt obscene. I reached for the headset. The Bakelite was slick with my sweat. I pulled it over my ears, drowning out Henry's ragged breathing, drowning out the world. I found the frequency. The static hissed, a comfortingly empty sound. I placed my fingers on the key. My hand was trembling so violently that the first attempt to depress the lever resulted in a stutter, an incomprehensible slur of dots. I closed my eyes. I forced the air into my lungs, holding it there until my chest burned. I pictured the lecture hall in Lyon, the rows of wooden desks, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight, the pure, mathematical silence of an equation balancing out. Vogas. I clamped my left hand over my right wrist, locking the muscle into place. I began to tap. Dash, dash, dash. The boots were on the first landing. The sound was distinct now, separated from the general chaos. I could hear the clinking of equipment, the heavy breathing of men moving fast in full gear. They were not cautious. They knew we were here. They were racing the signal. I typed the coordinates. 45 north, 4 east. The rhythm flowed through me, bypassing the terror, bypassing the logic of survival. I became the machine. I was no longer Jean-Luc Dubois, student of philosophy. I was a conduit of copper and wire. Second floor. A door was kicked open. A woman screamed, Madame Gerard. The seamstress. I flinched, missing a beat, but I forced the rhythm back. I could not save her. I could not save myself. I could only save the message. The footsteps hit the wooden stairs leading to the attic. They were louder now, vibrating through the table, shaking the glowing vacuum tubes of the transmitter. The radio hummed hot and alive. It was the only warm thing in a world that had gone cold. I reached the final line, the confirmation code. Outside the attic door, the footsteps stopped. There was a moment of silence, heavier than the noise. Then a voice right against the wood. Off mission, software, open up, immediately. I did not stop. Dash, dash, dash. The first blow hit the door. The wood groaned, a high-pitched shriek of tearing grain. The lock held, but the frame buckled. Dust rained down from the rafters, coating the code book in a fine gray powder. I blew it away without breaking the cadence. Another blow. The tip of a crowbar punched through the paneling, a jagged tongue of iron tasting the air of the room. It withdrew with a screech. I was on the last group of 5 characters. The door was dissolving under the assault. I could see through the cracks now, flashes of field gray wool, the dull gleam of a helmet. Henry was gone. The skylight was open, the rain spitting onto the floor. I tapped the final character, the period, the end. I ripped the headset off. The sound of the world crashed in, the splintering wood, the shouting, the blood rushing in my ears. I grabbed the quartz crystal from the radio's socket, the heart of the machine. It burned my palm. I shoved it into my pocket. The door exploded inward. I did not look back. I launched myself at the chair, driving it under the handle of the trapdoor, a futile gesture, a second of bought time. I scrambled up the stack of old crates toward the open skylight. The rain hit my face, cold and shocking. I pulled myself up, my fingernails scrabbling against the wet light of the frame. A shout from below, a deafening crack. A bullet punched through the plaster next to my head, showering me in white dust. I kicked out, my boot connecting with the frame, propelling me through the opening and onto the roof. I rolled, the wet slate slick as ice under me. I slid, clawing at the tiles, my fingers tearing, until my boot caught the lip of the gutter. I lay there gasping, the rain mixing with the sweat and dust on my face. Below me, inside the attic, I heard the heavy boots storm the room. I heard the crash of the radio being swept onto the floor. I heard the frustration in their voices. They had the machine, but the bird had flown. But I wasn't flying. I was crawling, a wet rat scuttling across the spine of the city. I moved along the crest of the roof, the tiles shifting dangerously under my weight. Lyon stretched out around me, a blackout necropolis of wet stone and fear. The sirens were everywhere now, a wailing choir surrounding the block. I made it to the neighboring building, dropping down onto a flat terrace. I huddled in the shadow of a chimney stack, my knees pulled to my chest, shaking so hard my teeth rattled. I waited for Henry. I waited for the scrape of boots on slate, the whisper of his arrival. Minutes passed, then an hour. The rain soaked through my jacket, chilling me to the marrow. Below in the street, the shouting continued. I heard engines starting. I heard the slam of truck doors. And then, I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was not a gunshot. It was a name. Someone shouted a name. It wasn't mine. I stayed on that roof until the sun turned the gray clouds to the color of a bruise. I never saw Henry again. Decades dissolve the sharp edges of the world, but they do not touch the memory. The memory is granite. I am an old man now. The students at the university, where I taught for 30 years, they look at me and see a relic. They see tweed jackets and chalk dust. They see a man who spent his life discussing the categorical imperative and the logic of history. They do not know that the only logic I truly understand is the binary of the key. Open, closed, life, death. I sit in my study, the window overlooking a garden that is too peaceful. My hands are spotted with age, but when the weather turns cold, the right wrist still aches. A phantom cramp from a night in 1942. The war ended. The parades marched down the Champs-Élysées. The collaborators were shaved or shot. The monuments were built, but the radio in my head never stopped transmitting. I often think about the transaction of that night. It is a calculation I have run 1,000 times, a formula that never balances. I traded the location of a munitions train for the safety of my unit. I traded the silence of the night for the scream of the sirens. But the real trade was deeper. I was a student when I walked up those stairs. I believed in the abstract purity of truth. I believed that if you understood the world, you could fix it. But when I came down from those rooftops, sliding down a drain pipe into a filthy alley at dawn, the student was gone. He had been left in the attic, obliterated by the sound of the axe. In his place was something colder, a man who knew that truth is not a concept to be debated in a seminar. Truth is a coordinate. It is a piece of information that costs blood to acquire and blood to send. I realized then that the machine of history is not an engine of progress. It is a grinder. It is fed by the bodies of boys who wanted to be doctors, or poets or philosophers. It consumes them and spits out dates and victory parades. I carry the guilt of that night like a shrapnel wound that never healed. Did Henry get away? Did he divert them so I could escape? Did my transmission save 100 men, or did it just kill the 5 who were with me? The silence that followed my escape is the loudest thing I have ever heard. It is a void where my friends used to be. People speak of the resistance as a glorious uprising. They speak of heroism. They do not speak of the cold. They do not speak of the damp roof tiles and the smell of your own terror. They do not speak of the terrible weight of the key. The knowledge that every dot and dash is a betrayal of your own safety, a deliberate choice to draw the lightning down upon yourself. I look at the young people today, with their phones and their instant connections, their ability to speak to the world with a thumb swipe. They transmit their lives in high definition, terrified of being ignored. We were terrified of being heard. We screamed in code, praying that the right people were listening and the wrong people were deaf. My war did not end with a treaty. It ended with a realization. The harvest of that year was not wheat or wine. The harvest was us. We were the crop, threshed and broken so that something else could grow. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.